Welcome to Market Overtime. I'm Oliver Rennick. You're watching the Schwab Network. Thanks for tuning in. It's 2 months until the election. We just heard the first debate between the candidates, and it's time to start thinking about what impact policy could have on markets. A juncture when the Fed is prepared to begin cutting for the first time after its hike cycle. Joining us today on Market Overtime is Stephen Moore. He's a senior economic advisor to the Trump campaign and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a regular on the Schwab Network on economics. Stephen, great to see you here for a longer form interview. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So we're recording this day after the debate. So let's kind of first talk about the economics that we heard there. How much do you think the candidates solidified their economic positions versus this still being sort of an ad hominem personal situation?
Well, I'm frustrated. I think as many Americans are. There wasn't much of an economic discussion, was there? Really, it was, as you said, a lot of personal attacks against each other and a lot of talk about abortion and social issues, but not. It was really unfortunate. There wasn't a lot of discussion about what do each of the candidates want to do, what's their vision for the economy. There were a lot of platitudes, but not really any specific debates about. Let me give you a specific example of what I'm talking about. I think for investors and for American workers and for American families, the biggest issue out there right now in the economy is these two. Number one, what are we going to do about a $35 trillion national debt? And number two, where are we going with tax policy? And, Kamala Harris has proposed a $4.6 trillion tax increase, according to the New York Times. That's a big deal for the economy. It's a really big deal for investors, and it never even was brought up in the debate. So if I sound a little frustrated, I am, because I think Americans deserve a good discussion about two candidates that could not be more polar opposite in terms of how they want to handle the economy and what policies they want to put in place.
One of the big things that stood out to me from a market perspective is the way inflation and jobs were described. That's where it seemed the candidates veered the most from how a rational, fair market observer would describe things. As an example, one, Vice President Harris saying that the economic drop-off was due to Trump, right? Like, okay, we had COVID, massive black swan event. To try and tie unemployment to the policy seems like a huge, egregious stretch. But then former President Trump says stuff like inflation is raging as hard as it's ever been. Like, this is the whole trend of the bull market running a year and a half, is that inflation subsided substantially. So how do we get to these extremes, Stephen? Where's the in-between?
Well, let me sort of talk from the perspective of a Trump advisor, because
Absolutely.
I do think Trump has a far superior economic record. There's no doubt about that, and also a better economic program. I think that, what we've been trying to tell Trump is really stick to the three I's in this debate, in this, presidential election. Those three I's, I bet you can guess what those are. Number one, immigration. And we did have a pretty substantial discussion about immigration, but it's a huge issue for the American people when you have 11, 12 million illegal immigrants into the country. The second one is incomes. How are people doing? What's happening to their paychecks? Those are down. Even with the new census data, Americans are poorer today than they were 5 years ago before COVID. So Biden's policies have not really helped the middle class. They've hurt them. And then the third one is inflation, the one you just mentioned. Now, there's good news and bad news on the inflation front. On the good news side, inflation is down to maybe 3%, a little bit lower than 3%. But for families, the problem is that their prices that they're paying for everything that they buy, everything from gasoline to groceries to movie tickets to airline tickets to a dozen eggs, those prices are up roughly 20% on average, but people's incomes are only up about 17 or 18% on average. So you can see there's a mismatch there, and that's a big deal. I wish Trump had talked more about mortgages, mortgage payments are 70% higher than they were. I wish he had talked about gas prices, which are $1 a gallon higher. And that look, for people who are upper income or really rich, that's not a big deal. But for people who are living on an income of $60, $70, $80, $90,000 a year, they're really feeling financially stressed. And there wasn't, I don't think Donald Trump did a very good job of explaining and connecting the dots of why that inflation happened and what we have to do to alleviate it.
Stephen, the argument that a lot of it was supply chain centric, unavoidable no matter who was in charge when this black swan shutdown of the global economy due to a virus happens. In your view, what degree of contribution did that have? Because if that's the case, then blame obviously gets lessened substantially.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. But before I forget, because this is related to your question, I want to have people go to the website unleashprosperitynow.com. That's unleashprosperitynow.com, and you can pull down what we call our economic chart book, which has 26 slides, really comparing what happened to the economy when Trump was president and what happened to the economy, in the Biden-Harris regime. And, we just do the side-by-side comparison, everything from what happened to prices, what happened to, people's real incomes, what happened to small business confidence, what happened to the stock market, on and on, mortgage rates. And what you find there is that, on 22 of the 25 variables, the economy did better under Trump than it has under Biden-Harris. I wish Trump had said that in the debate, but he didn't.
Okay.
And so, the fact now on the issue that you just raised, which is a good question about was this inflation that we saw inevitable? And that's I've debated many of the, my friends who are Biden people. One of the arguments they make is like some of this inflation was baked in the cake, as you just said, like this supply chain issue. I think there's two problems with that explanation. One is that there was, look, the expansion for out of COVID began in June of 2024. I mean, in June of 2020. Mm-hmm. So that means that we were already in a 6-month expansion by the time Biden came into office. In fact, I wish Trump had, the economy grew by 11% in the second half of 2020.
As the market bottomed.
So, but here's the thing that's interesting. So you would have thought that there would have been supply chain problems as all the activities and businesses reopened, and yet the last 4 months Trump was in office, the inflation rate was 1.4%, 1.2%, 1.4%, 1.5%. So look, there was no inflation when Trump was in office, even as the economy began to expand. Now, something happened between the election and the day that Joe Biden was inaugurated, which is Trump very foolishly, in my opinion, and the Congress passed another $1.4 trillion spending bill.
Okay.
It was completely unnecessary. The economy was already recovering without massive new deficit spending. And then what happened after that, of course, is that Biden and Harris did something, probably the most financially irresponsible thing in our country. They added another $5 trillion of spending on top of that. And I would submit that that's what caused, I want to make sure people can connect these dots. Why did we have inflation go from 1.5% when Trump was president to 9.1% 18 months later? It was because of the massive spending binge. And the residue of that continues to hang as Americans, every time they go to the grocery store or the gas pumps, they're sort of paying a tax for that incredible spending binge.
Okay. Now we look at the trend, though, for debt deficit. I mean, you know as well as I do, Stephen, it basically goes up and to the right over time. Of course, inflation doesn't do that. So the idea that these things are perfectly correlated doesn't add up with the history of general indebtedness increasing. It seems like the rate of change, which is where we come back to this COVID thing, makes such a big deal because we had so much basically squeezed into a moment. But to your point, real wages have stagnated, which is very true. So even though inflation has cooled off, we haven't turned to deflation, right? So those prices are still elevated. But to even just look at the one of the things that President Trump loves, which is the stock market, right? This idea that this is like a Marxist opponent who comes from a Marxist regime. The stock market's up 50%, and that's after the full COVID recovery. We've got the biggest breakthrough in technology possibly in a decade with AI. How is that the result of a Marxist labeled economic regime?
So I have to correct you on this. So and this is why you need to go look at our chart book as well.
Okay.
Because as you know, and hopefully all your viewers and investors understand, hopefully you're interested in your after inflation rate of return on stocks, not your before inflation rate of return. So if you look at the real return on stocks, the returns were much, much higher when Trump was president, even taking into account COVID, than they've been under Biden, because you have to subtract 20% of that 50% gain, because it's all due to just the inflation and prices. So there's no doubt about it that the stock market, the NASDAQ, the Dow, and the S&P did substantially better in real terms when Trump was president.
So if you normalize by inflation, also that's if you're taking your profits on your stocks. If you hold your stocks, inflation comes down, then obviously a different story depending on when you close them out. But here's the thing: we've had what's been this massive revolution with technology, and how does that?
Even if you pull out your returns later, that inflation is embedded into the value of the stock. So you don't have to sell it now to have to pay that inflation penalty. What I'm saying is, whenever you pull it out, it could be 5 years from now, you're going to still pay that 20% inflation. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s, by the way, is that, that was the worst decade, since the 1920s for the stock market. And one of the reasons the stock market did so poorly was because inflation was so high. So I just want to make the case that inflation is the enemy, is the villain of a healthy stock market.
Okay, so then to come back to the point about inflation, then, Stephen, because this comes back to this kind of idea of when the deficit or debt starts to matter. Obviously, that piled up under President Trump as well. He issued stimulus checks. He did come to the rescue, to the credit of the stock market, to the credit of many people who that did help out in a big way, right? He likes to say he signed the stimmy checks, but to say then that had no influence on inflation seems a little bit disingenuous.
So you mean
all those things are the same forces that send deficit, since debt ratio is higher, the stuff that you're saying under the Biden administration is causing inflation. So shouldn't some of that also fall on the shoulders of Trump, who did issue all of that, who did make all that big monetary move?
Yes. I mean, and I think we spent way too much money under Trump, no question, to try to keep the economy from totally crashing. And remember, the greatest mistake in American history, arguably, maybe next to the Civil War, was shutting down of the American economy.
Sure.
It was a total disaster, and lockdowns did not save lives. Lockdowns were a complete failure. And so you had, half of the businesses in America shut down. 80% of workers weren't going to work. You had a shipwrecked economy at that point. And so, but here's, I don't want to get too much detail here. So you're right. There was all this spending already in the pipeline, under Trump, that we had all of these payments, and then Biden comes in and adds $5 trillion to that.
I hear you.
So why would you do that? I mean,
it's a fair point.
The last thing the economy needed when Biden came into office was another massive 3 debt bills, and so that's where I think we made a major mistake. Now, let me make another.
To real quick, Stephen, because I think that's a really important middle ground there, right? Which is that, not arguing that we needed to pile on further, but that there is a non-zero responsibility for some of those inflationary, some of those debt forces that extend back to the Trump admin.
I've always said this, by the way, Oliver. That, look, I'm a Republican. I work, but
But you didn't like how that last year went down. I know you've told us that before.
To your audience, but both parties love to play Santa Claus. Politicians love to spend money. And one of the things I think, since this is an educated, listenership and viewership, is that, look, in my opinion, the debt in and of itself is, in other words, borrowing, as you know, is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's perfectly appropriate to borrow. So, for example, I used to go back to when Ronald Reagan was president. We had an economy that was completely flat on its back. It had been destroyed by massive inflation and all sorts of overregulation and high tax rates. And Reagan came in and he did 2 things. We borrowed to finance one of the biggest tax cuts in American history, which rebuilt the American economy. And then we rebuilt our American military so that that we could win the Cold War. Well, those were perfectly appropriate things to borrow for, because guess what? The benefits of those, benefited future generations. What worries me and what bothers me about what we're borrowing money for now is there's no return on any of this. I mean, there's no return. I mean, Kamala Harris in the debate the other day said, we've spent $1 trillion on green energy. Yeah, what have you gotten for it? Nothing. There's no green energy transition going on. People aren't buying EVs. Solar and wind power still suck as, very minor forms of power in our country. We're still 83%. We're still 83% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. That's no different from when it was when Biden came into office. So what happened to that $1 trillion?
And by the way, since the passage of the solar and energy support, those stocks have done terribly. So your point echoes within the stock market on that subject. And again, this would be a different conversation if it were an advisor to the Harris campaign. So I also like the point about how, levels of debt and what they're used for, because it makes a difference, right? The World War II comparison is the only other time we got debt, ratios at this level. Stephen,
we needed we used that money to defeat,
totally.
Of the Germany and the Nazis and
then this time the virus. No, I hear that.
Good. It's a good spending.
Stephen, here's one thing though that last night I'm like, who is giving the former president this information? He said something about semiconductors and chips that was like, what world are you living in? Talking about how the U.S. is not producing chips. I mean, that was kind of crazy. That's been the whole lifeblood pumping in the economy the last year. Intel's going bust. But other than that, we got NVIDIA here. We got all the big players here, all the hyperscalers. I mean, the innovation technology-wise, where is that coming from, this idea that we haven't had a capitalistic boom here?
Well, I'm not an expert on the chip industry, but
sure.
I will say this. That,
it's booming.
Right. I'm not a very good investor, but 18 months ago, I did put a lot of money in NVIDIA.
Well, there you go. I don't need to tell you.
It's the one good investment I've made in my life. But look, NVIDIA, by the way, is a chip maker, and they're incredible. They're leading the whole, revolution in artificial intelligence. They didn't get a penny of this CHIPS Act money. Whereas the companies that did get the CHIPS Act money aren't doing very well. So I'm always opposed to corporate welfare. I think giving companies government taxpayer money is almost always a bad idea. And I think the CHIPS Act is a good example of that.
Okay. Thinking about then where kind of the creativity comes from, is it, we've heard about tariffs from the former president. He was asked last night about a health care plan, said, hey, something might be in the works. Is there any ace up the sleeve that you see? Because so far, the only kind of out of the box thing I've heard from that side is the crypto stuff. And it's just after years of fraud and that being a joke, it's hard to see that as being the big ace up the sleeve.
So I think it's pretty easy, to understand kind of what Trump is going to do if he wins, and I think he probably will. We're going to pretty much do what we did in the first term. We'll keep our emphasis on keeping tax rate as low as possible. There will be tariffs, and by the way, I'm not a tariff guy, just so your audience knows. I disagree with Trump on tariffs, although I did see Trump use tariffs in a strategic way, in some effective ways when he was president. But I'm not in favor of the across-the-board tariff. I think that's a bad idea. We're going to deregulate big time. I mean, we're going to try to get government off the back of our businesses, which is, by the way, we did a study finding that the average household will pay $50,000, over the next 10 years in terms of lower income because of Biden's regulations. So we want to get rid of a lot of those. And the big question is whether Trump will actually do something about getting control of government spending. And I wish he would, because I think, look, we have a $7 trillion budget right now. We have to get back to the budget that we had back pre-COVID. Let's go back to $4 trillion and, save a couple $1 trillion a year. You could do that, as a layup. There's so much waste in the budget. So I can't guarantee you that he will do that, but I think we really need to get spending down. I think it's one of the highest priorities for our country right now, government spending.
I'll push the crypto subject one question back, because more important, I think, is how you anticipate President Trump to handle the Fed and inflation. Is there an obvious way to bring those prices down further? Because so far, it's basically been kind of brute force, and that's where the economy is starting to struggle here. But that's basically a Fed situation. How do you think he handles that?
Well, look, the Fed, I think investors tend to overestimate the impact of the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board follows interest rates. They don't set interest rates for the most part. And the way you control inflation, in other words, the problems with our economy right now are not primarily monetary. We have, I think, obviously Jerome Powell's made some big mistakes in recent years. But right now, we have inflation has come down. It has come down a little bit more, but I don't think inflation is the problem right now. I think that what keeps me up at night, and what should keep your investors up at night, is the idea that we can raise $4.5 trillion of taxes on investors and businesses, and that's not going to have a negative effect. Now, I've done sort of back of the envelope calculations on the increase in the corporate tax rate, the increase in and by the way, when you raise the corporate tax rate, so people just understand, all you're doing is diluting the value of shareholders' stocks, right? So if I own NVIDIA and the government increases the corporate tax, and so let's say they add 10 percentage points on the profits tax, that means, think of a 33% corporate tax rate, which is what Kamala Harris wants, as the United States government becoming a 33% shareholder in the company, right? Because essentially they get 1/3 of the profits. Well, is that good or bad for investors? Obviously, it dilutes the value of your shares. So my point is, increasing the corporate tax has to reduce the value of your stock. Increasing the capital gains tax has to reduce the value of your stock.
Sure.
Tax capital gains and dividends has to reduce the value of your stock. So I've done some back of the envelope calculations. And I would say that if Kamala were to win, and if she were to adopt that tax plan, you would see about a 30 to 35% reduction in the value you'd see a big market reaction to that. So I'm always asked, why hasn't the market reacted to these proposals? And I think one is because a lot of people don't think Kamala is going to win.
Sure.
And two, I think a lot of people think that even if she does win,
she wouldn't be able to get that.
Actually be enacted into law.
That's pretty interesting.
That because if Kamala wins, if she wins, it's likely that she will have a Democratic House and Democratic Senate. And there won't be a lot of ways for Republicans to stop this stuff. And so I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, I think it's a really... It's a fascinating study. I want to see it because the logic, I feel, I wouldn't dispute the logic. Obviously, I don't know your calculations, the math, so I think that's a pretty interesting, it's a good calculation to do because I do think the logic follows on the notion of the government being a shareholder in a negative way. Stephen, lastly before we go though, what's with the crypto stuff? Seriously, like, well, what's going on? Who's behind that? Like, what's the plan?
I haven't talked to Donald Trump specifically about that, so I don't know.
Okay, do me a favor, ask him next time because that's not the way to go. First time around was like a real economic plan. Now we're like selling NFTs and stuff. Like, I don't want to go down that road too far.
My quick view on cryptos is they're here to stay. I don't invest in cryptos, but I actually think it's a positive impact on the economy. And the reason I think cryptos, like Bitcoin, are important is they've created a kind of competition with central bankers. That's why all the central bankers hate cryptos, because they don't want the competition. They don't want people to have alternative to government fiat money. And I think that has a real disciplining effect on what the central planning bankers can do, because if they screw up their currencies, people now have an alternative, a private sector alternative. I think that's a healthy thing. And again, I'm not here to sell people on cryptos. I don't really own them myself. But I think the future is more and more towards digital currencies, obviously. And, we've seen central bankers make so many mistakes over the years that having a kind of disciplining mechanism is a good thing. I don't exactly understand, like Trump saying that, we're going to have a crypto dollar and things like that.
Right,
I don't really understand what he's talking about there, but that's not my wheelhouse.
All right, Stephen, last one. Jay Powell, should he keep his job?
Should what?
Should Jay Powell keep his job?
Oh, Jay Powell. No, he's going to be gone. He's gone, and if Trump is elected, I don't know. I think it could be Kevin Hassett, who's an economist who I work with, and a solid guy. I think it could be Kevin Warsh, who also worked for the Federal Reserve Board. There's some talk about maybe Arthur Laffer, one of the most famous economists who ever lived.
Sure.
So now, if Kamala wins, I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't rehire Powell. I think he's been really overrated. I mean, he allowed the inflation rate to go up to 9%. I remember in 2017. I don't know if you recall this, but he was so tight on money. We almost had a little mini recession there. And finally, he cut interest rates, and the economy just exploded in 2018 and 2019. So, we'll see what happens to Powell. But I would put pretty high odds that he will not be renominated. I think he's still got 2 years to go or something.
Yeah, the term goes into the presidential term. Stephen, thanks a lot for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it very much.
Oliver, great to be with you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for the time. Stephen Moore, Senior Economic Advisor to the Trump campaign and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us on Market Overtime. Make sure you check out all the episodes on the program through our YouTube channel, Schwab Network, YouTube. I'm Oliver Rennick. I'll see you next time.